It was called the Orange Blossom, but in reality, it was born amid ruins and despair. The first Japanese jet aircraft, a machine they tried to hide in caves from Allied bombings and assembled by hand by unskilled laborers while cities lay in ashes. It took to the skies just one day after Hiroshima, and a few days later, the second attempt ended in an accident that showed the fragility of hope. This project was inspired by a German wonder weapon, created from photographs of a stolen engine, and was conceived as a single-use apparatus for deadly missions. It could have become a reconnaissance plane, an interceptor, or a weapon of revenge, but it turned into a legend that was forever too late. What did the Americans hide when they took it to the States? What blueprints and plans remained in the safes? And why is this aircraft still called a symbol of an unfulfilled breakthrough? The answers await you until the very end. Its name sounded surprisingly gentle, Kikka, which translated to orange blossom, a name seemingly created for a spring garden or poems about nature awakening, was attached to a project that was supposed to change the course of the war. In this paradox lay the entire mood of Japan in the final months of 1944. A country cornered, it sought a miracle where only ruins and despair remained. In the Pacific, the initiative was fully shifting to the enemy. Cities were subjected to regular raids. The fleet suffered heavy losses. Yet, hope lived on. Hope that a new weapon could break the inexorable reality. Military strategists and admirals understood that conventional aircraft could no longer compete with the power of Allied aviation. A sharp leap was needed, a step into a new dimension of technology. All eyes turned to jet propulsion, a technology capable of providing speeds that conventional piston engines could no longer achieve. It was in this atmosphere that the project was born, given a soft, almost poetic name, but with a purpose that was extremely harsh. For the Imperial Navy, this was not just another initiative. It was a desperate investment of the last resources into an idea that seemed to offer a chance at survival. Kikka was conceived not as a symbol of beauty, but as the embodiment of hope, the last ace up Japan's sleeve. Every element of the project breathed duality. On one hand, the fragile poetry in the name. On the other, a harsh calculation, reinforced by the realization that there was no time left for slow steps. In a country where factories could no longer handle mass production due to bombings, where the ranks of engineers and workers were dwindling day by day, launching such a project seemed like a daring challenge to fate. And yet, it was this challenge that led to the birth of the aircraft, which was to become the first Japanese jet combat apparatus, entering history as a technical experiment against the backdrop of an impending collapse. In 1942, when the war still didn't seem lost for Japan, a group of its military representatives went to Germany. It was a trip full of observations and conclusions that left a deep impression on the officers. Among the many examples of technology that the Third Reich was proud of, the new jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262, made a special impression. It hadn't yet been widely deployed in combat, but its very concept seemed like science fiction. Speed that conventional fighters couldn't match, a new wing shape, and the sleek lines of the fuselage. The Japanese saw not just another combat aircraft, but a technological breakthrough that promised to change the rules of air warfare. They understood that if such machines appeared in the sky in large numbers, their capabilities would be unreachable for any piston engine aircraft. This experience was impossible to forget. It became an alarming signal for Japanese military thought. Falling behind in jet technology could prove fatal. The impressions gained in Germany were meticulously reported to the Imperial Navy Command. The officers emphasized that if they did not begin creating their own jet aircraft, Japan risked being left on the sidelines of a new era of aviation. This is how the idea that was later named Kikka was born. The German design became not only a source of inspiration, but also a kind of benchmark that the Japanese tried to emulate. The Mien 262 showed them what had previously seemed almost impossible: speed and power combined with technological elegance. For Japanese engineers, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. Their task was not to blindly copy the German model, but to create a machine that could be born under the conditions of their own industry, limited by resources and time. Thus, the German footprint became the starting point, the very spark from which the idea of creating the first Japanese jet aircraft ignited. The Imperial Navy, inspired by the German example and realizing the hopelessness of the current situation, decided on a step that would have seemed insane in peacetime. One of the country's largest aviation companies, Nakajima, was tasked with developing a jet attack aircraft that was to be a weapon of last resort. The requirements were not just high, they seemed contradictory, as if dictated by desperation. The designers had to create an aircraft that could be assembled quickly, even in bombed-out factories, by unskilled workers and women who had just yesterday been working textile looms. Simplicity of design became more important than elegant lines or engineering sophistication. Every extra bolt, every unnecessary detail could cause a delay and a failure of the project. Another unusual requirement was the ability to secretly deploy the aircraft. In the face of daily Allied air raids, hangars were no longer a safe haven. The Kikka had to be compact enough to be hidden in tunnels carved into cliffs or in caves that served as natural shelters. To achieve this, engineers designed folding wings, a solution more common for carrier-based aircraft, but now a necessity on land. The entire project brief was imbued with the pressure of time, a short takeoff from damaged runways, ease of maintenance, minimal resources for assembly, and at the same time, high speed to at least somewhat catch up with the enemy's achievements. This was a task for survival, literally reflecting Japan's position in the last months of the war. The aircraft was to be not a masterpiece, but a working tool, created under conditions where every week decided the fate of the country. Engineers Kazuo Ono and Kenichi Matsumura took on the Kikka project. These were the people destined to bring the Imperial Navy's most risky plans to life. The task of combining the dream of the jet era with the harsh reality of a semi-ruined country fell on their shoulders. Both understood that they had almost no time, and every decision had to be fast and accurate. The military demanded a machine that, at least externally, resembled the German Me-262. And indeed, the Kikka's outlines were created with an eye on that model: 2 engines, a low-wing design, similar fuselage proportions. But that's where the similarities ended. Unlike the German aircraft with its swept wings, the Japanese version had a straight wing, which simplified production, but made the machine less aerodynamic. It was smaller, lighter, and simpler in construction, as every detail was calculated under the condition of extreme resource scarcity. Initially, an option was considered that itself reflected the desperation of the situation. Without landing gear, with the ability to take off only once for a kamikaze-style attack. In this version, the aircraft would turn into a guided bomb, capable of carrying only one explosive payload. But the engineers, understanding that such an approach would sharply reduce the project's value, began to look for ways to make it a full-fledged combat aircraft, suitable for multiple sorties. Thus began work on a machine that combined borrowed features and its own technical compromises. It had the shadow of the German prototype and the unique solutions of Japanese engineers trying to get the most out of minimal resources. Every difference from the Me-262 was not so much a choice as a forced step. And in this lay the uniqueness of the Kikka, an aircraft that was to be born against all odds. Creating the fuselage and wings was only half the battle. The main problem was that Japan did not have its own full-fledged jet engine. Initial attempts to circumvent this barrier looked frankly weak. The designers tried to use the NE-11, a hybrid unit consisting of a piston engine that drove a gas turbine. It was too underpowered and was more suitable for experimental gliders than for a combat aircraft. Then came the NE-12, the first step towards a true turbojet scheme. But this engine also lacked sufficient thrust. The aircraft simply couldn't gain the necessary speed and remained a toy on paper. The situation changed when the Japanese got their hands on a few photographs of the German BMW 003 engine. They were brought to the country by an officer, Eiichi Iwai, who had participated in a military mission to Europe. No blueprints, no samples, just photos on which the general layout could be seen. And yet, it was these images that became the starting point for a real breakthrough. Engineers from Ishikawajima, working in parallel with Nakajima, decided on a bold step. Based on the photographs and fragmentary data, they developed their own NE-20 engine. It became the first axial flow turbojet engine of Japanese production. Its thrust was about 475 kgf. Not a record figure, but sufficient for the Kikka to at least theoretically be able to take off and fight. The appearance of the NE-20 marked the birth of the Japanese jet school. From scratch, under conditions of constant raids, a shortage of metals and specialists, they managed to create a unit that opened the door to a completely new era of aviation. For a country where the thought of a mass-produced jet aircraft seemed like a distant fantasy just recently, this was almost a miracle, born not from an abundance of resources, but from a dire necessity. When the first engine tests showed that the aircraft could indeed become a reality, the Imperial Navy formulated precise requirements. They sounded like a challenge, but at the same time, they created the image of a machine that, on paper, looked like an almost perfect answer to the threat from the air. They expected the Kikka to have a maximum speed of about 692 km/h, a level that would allow it to at least catch up with the best examples of Allied aviation, if not surpass them. At the same time, the range was to be from 200 to 270 kilometers, depending on the combat load. This was not a lot, but it was enough for close-range attack operations, where the decisive factor was the speed of the attack, not the duration of the flight. Special attention was paid to takeoff. Given Japan's ruined infrastructure, the aircraft had to be able to take off from a runway no longer than 350 meters. For this, the project immediately included the possibility of using rocket-assisted takeoff units, which would provide the necessary thrust during acceleration. This solution would allow the use of even temporary airfields, camouflaged deep within the country. The armament options also reflected the versatility of the concept. In one version, it was planned to carry a single large bomb, weighing up to 800 kilojoules, turning the aircraft into a ground attack plane. In another, two 30mm Type 5 cannons would be installed, making it an interceptor. This approach allowed the Kikka to be used in different roles depending on the situation. On the blueprints, everything looked convincing. The numbers inspired hope that the machine would be able to at least partially compensate for the enemy's technical superiority. For the Navy Command, this project became a symbol that the country could still provide an answer. And although the reality of production was far from these ambitions, at that moment, the Kikka looked like a promise, a weapon capable of giving Japan a chance to linger in the sky a little longer. By mid-1945, the very idea of building a new aircraft seemed almost absurd. Japanese industry was falling apart. Factories that had recently produced dozens of machines turned into heaps of metal after massive air raids. Production lines stopped, workshops were destroyed by explosions, and skilled workers disappeared. Some died, others went to the front. Under these conditions, the Kikka project became not just an engineering task, but a true test of survival for the country's entire aviation industry. To continue the work, Nakajima had to move production from cities to the countryside, where they could still find shelter from bombings. Parts were assembled in scattered workshops, sometimes literally in school buildings or semi-ruined warehouses. Ordinary workers, accustomed to repairing carts or forging iron for agricultural tools, suddenly became the creators of a jet aircraft. All this happened under the constant pressure of time and the realization that every new raid could destroy the last preparations. And yet, despite the chaos, the first prototype was completed. By the end of July 1945, the Kikka was assembled and prepared for transportation. It was carefully delivered to the Kisarazu Naval Air Base, which was to be the site of the first tests. The machine looked not like a masterpiece of technological thought, but as the result of a titanic effort amid devastation. It was as if it were a symbol that even on the ruins, the Empire continued to seek a path to the future. Every bolt, every panel of the fuselage was a silent testament to despair and hope at the same time. In a country where cities were turning into ashes and the future was clouded by the smoke of fires, an aircraft was born that was destined to become Japan's first step into the jet era. On August 7, 1945, a silence filled with tense anticipation reigned at Kisarazu Air Base. Just a day ago, the world learned of the disaster in Hiroshima, and now, as if in defiance of the tragic news, Japan was preparing to lift its first jet aircraft into the sky. The test pilot, Susumu Takaoka, a man with cold composure and a steady hand, took the controls. He was to test a machine assembled in conditions of devastation and haste. When the NE-20 engines came to life with a low hum, everyone standing nearby knew this was not just a test, but an event that could become a symbol of the country's last hope. The aircraft accelerated and easily lifted off the runway, taking to the skies for the first time. It stayed over Tokyo Bay for only 11 minutes, but that was enough to leave engineers and military personnel with mixed feelings. Takaoka immediately noted that the machine responded obediently to commands, although the elevator was a bit too sensitive, and the ailerons and rudder were too stiff. The handling was acceptable, but clearly required refinement. The fuel consumption was far more alarming. The tank emptied faster than expected. In addition, the engine suffered from a delay in throttle response, and below 6,000 RPM, there was a risk of flameout. The pilot landed the Kikka without incident, and this first flight went down in history as proof that Japan had, after all, managed to step into the jet era. But along with pride came disappointment. In 11 minutes, it became clear that the path to full combat use would be much more difficult than it had seemed on paper. On August 11, 1945, just a few days after the first flight, engineers and military personnel gathered again at the Kisarazu base. This time, the test was meant to show the main thing. Could the Kikka take off from a short runway with the help of rocket boosters? Without this solution, the aircraft would lose half of its purpose, as the ability to take off with minimal run-up made it potentially suitable for use in a ruined infrastructure. Susumu Takaoka was once again preparing for takeoff. Two boosters attached under the fuselage were supposed to provide an additional push, allowing the machine to take off in just a few seconds. But an error was made during installation. The angle was incorrect. As soon as the aircraft began its takeoff roll, the rockets fired and the Kikka's nose sharply pitched upward. Losing visual contact with the runway, Takaoka tried to hold the machine level, but the speed began to drop. The aircraft was at risk of stalling. The test pilot made the only possible decision: to abort the takeoff. The Kikka rolled off the end of the runway, crossed a field, went through a ditch, and came to a stop in shallow water. The landing gear was damaged, the engines were affected, and with them, the hopes for a quick continuation of the program. The accident was not a catastrophe in the usual sense, but its consequences proved fatal for the project. The machine had to be grounded and time was running out. Just a few days later, the country was to capitulate, and this failed takeoff became a symbol that the Kikka's fate had been decided even before it had a chance to truly prove itself. On August 15, 1945, the radio brought the words that millions of Japanese had so feared. The emperor announced the surrender. For the country, it was the end of the war. For the Kikka, the end of its future. On that day, it became clear that the second prototype, which was already in the final stages of assembly, would never take to the air. At the Nakajima factories, engineers found a strange sight. Rows of unfinished fuselages, about 25 of them, that never turned into aircraft. They stood in the workshops like ghosts of unfulfilled hopes. Each of them was a beginning that was not destined to continue. The technical team, which had recently worked under conditions of haste and constant raids, now found themselves in a situation where their labor had been devalued overnight. No one asked about refinements or tests. No one demanded new calculations. All the efforts, all the risky decisions and compromises were frozen at the moment when the country's history took a turn for which the Kikka was merely a footnote. This aircraft was supposed to become a symbol of resistance and a last-ditch effort, but instead it remained a project stopped one step away from realization. Its fate was determined not by technology or the will of the engineers, but by events far more massive than the history of a single jet aircraft. Although the first prototype failed and the second was never tested, new ideas were already maturing in the design bureaus. The engineers were not limited to the attack variant. Projects for reconnaissance modifications were considered, capable of penetrating deep into enemy territory at high speeds and returning with data. There were also plans to create a full-fledged interceptor, armed with powerful 30mm Type 5 cannons. Such a variant would make the Kikka a dangerous opponent for the bombers that were increasingly appearing over Japan. The key to these dreams was the more powerful NE-20 engines, which could be refined and made to deliver significantly more thrust. In some blueprints, the installation of their improved versions was discussed, which would open the possibility of increasing speed and range. This would transform the aircraft from a desperate limited capability attack plane into a full-fledged combat machine capable of competing with at least some examples of Allied aviation. Variants with reconnaissance equipment and improved aerodynamics could have made the Kikka the first Japanese platform for dual-use jet technology, and a modernized interceptor, in the event of a prolonged war, would have become a serious argument against massive raids. But all these plans remained on paper. If Japan had had more months or even years, the Kikka could have turned from a symbol of despair into a symbol of a new technical level. However, time played a decisive role, and the project remained a draft of a possible future that never came to be. When the war ended, the Americans carefully inspected Japanese factories to understand what projects had been underway in the final months. Among the heaps of metal, unfinished aircraft, and abandoned parts, they found several Kikka airframes and NE-20 engines. For U.S. Navy researchers, this was an unexpected discovery. Japan, despite the devastation, had still managed to create its own jet aircraft. One of the specimens was sent to the United States and delivered to Patuxent River Naval Air Station. The aircraft was carefully studied, but it never flew there. The Americans understood that by that time, their own jet programs had advanced far, and the Japanese project no longer held serious practical interest. The NE-20 engines drew special attention. They were handed over to the Chrysler Corporation, whose engineers assembled a working example from the remaining parts. For almost 12 hours, the engine was tested on a stand, and despite its limited capabilities, it showed a surprising reliability for its origin. However, for the US, it was just a curiosity. Their jet technologies were at a different level, and such experiments simply confirmed how desperately Japan was trying to catch up with progress. In the end, the Kikka was too late. It was born too late to influence the outcome of the war, and had too modest characteristics to seriously interest the victors. For the Americans, it became not a weapon of the future, but a kind of historical trophy, a confirmation that even in the final days of the war, Japan was trying to enter a new stage of the aviation era. Today, only a few surviving fragments serve as a reminder of the Kikka. Most of the airframes remained in the Nakajima workshops, where they were dismantled or scrapped. But several examples have been preserved and have become museum exhibits, offering a glimpse into that brief moment when Japan tried to enter the jet era. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum collection houses one of the two surviving airframes. It is displayed at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, where visitors can see the jet aircraft that never got its moment in the sky. The second example remains in the museum's reserves, hidden from the public eye but carefully preserved as a part of history. No less interesting is the fate of the NE-20 engines. In Tokyo, the National Museum of Nature and Science displays one of the original examples, a reminder of the courage of the Japanese engineers who created the engine literally from photographs of a German prototype. Other examples can be seen at the IHI Museum and the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, USA. These exhibits are silent witnesses that the project existed not only on paper, but also in metal. Every surviving fragment of the Kikka, be it an airframe or an engine, is like a frozen frame from the end of the war. It holds both the hope for a technical breakthrough and the bitterness that time worked against its creators. Thanks to museums, these traces have not disappeared without a trace, but continue to remind us of the attempt to build a jet future in an era when the country was crumbling before their eyes. The Kikka remained a project frozen at the boundary between dream and reality. It appeared at the most difficult moment in Japan's history, when the country was already losing cities and resources, but was still looking for a wonder weapon. This aircraft did not manage to become a combat machine, but this is precisely where its symbolism lies. It was born not for victory, but for the sake of hope itself, which dies last. For Japanese aviation, the Kikka was the beginning of the jet era. Even without entering mass production, it showed that in conditions of devastation and constant raids, it was possible to create a turbojet engine and get a new machine into the air. It was the first step, albeit timid and belated, but still a step towards the future. It remained a legend because it embodied several meanings at once. For engineers, it was a work that proved their ability to catch up with world technologies even without access to blueprints and resources. For historians, it is an example of how a technical breakthrough can remain unfulfilled because time ran out. For a modern audience, it is a reminder of how war forces the birth of projects that, in peacetime, could have become the basis of progress, not a symbol of despair. The Kikka did not become a weapon that changed the outcome of the war, but it remained in memory as a flower that bloomed too late. Its story is the story of an unfulfilled breakthrough, a machine that arose from the ruins and in the shadow of a catastrophe, but still left a mark on the history of world aviation.